You are listening to Oh My Health, There Is Hope podcast.
When your heart is aching and your world is shaking, don't give up. No, don't give up.
Hello and welcome to Oh My Health, There Is Hope, the podcast. I'm your host, Jana Short, and today I'm here with a very, very special guest, William Peters. William is a founder of Shared Crossing Project and director of its research initiative. Recognized as a global leader in the field of shared death studies, he has spent decades studying end-of-life experience. Previously, William worked as a hospice volunteer with the Zen Hospice Project in San Francisco, and as a teacher and social worker in Central and South America. A practicing psychotherapist, he holds degrees from Harvard's Graduate School of Education and UC Berkeley. His work on the end of life is informed by his therapeutic work in individuals and families facing grief and bereavement, personal experiences with death and dying across cultures, and his family's own end-of-life journeys. William is also the author of At Heaven's Door, which is releasing tomorrow, but when you get this, it's already out. And it's what shared journeys to the afterlife teach about dying well and living better. Welcome, William.
Hey, Jana, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
I'm so excited to dive into all of this because I think it's not touched on a lot because everybody grieves differently. And so I'm really glad that you're here today. But before we get into all of this, we always ask our guests at the beginning of every show to share a message of hope. Do you want to share your message of hope with us?
Well, my message of hope really comes out of my research, to be quite straightforward, is, I had a very difficult relationship with my father most of my life. And while he was dying, actually just at the moment he was dying and soon after, I had a shared death experience, which is, what my book is about and what I researched. And I didn't know if I was going to have this experience with him. But what I found just after he died was I was with him. Everyone had left the room. We were alone. And scenes of our life together came up like a movie playing right before me. And what it showed me was that even though we had a tough relationship, there were times when we did experience love together. And I couldn't really remember those as clearly as I could once. Once I saw this movie, I realized, oh yeah, there were times when we experienced goodness in our relationship and appreciation for one another. And that's what I try and focus on. And it's the parting gift from his death to me. And so there's definitely a message of hope for me, because I did struggle, as I said, with my father through most of my life.
And I know that you have written more about that story at the end of your book. It's one of the stories that you share in there. But what made you want to write this book? What made you want to help people with their grief and transition and letting them know like what that could be like?
Yeah, so great question. And, I work in end of life. I work with a lot of people dying. I work with a lot of people who are grieving the losses, and bereavement, as we call it. And so many people have just not pleasant, not good, painful end of life experiences. And but in the midst of that, I knew of many cases from being a hospice worker and also working in my clinical practice of really amazing, remarkable, spectacular experiences. And it's like I said, these are called shared crossings. These are experiences where people die and their loved ones' caregivers report that they shared in this transition from this life into a benevolent, wondrous afterlife. Those stories don't get very much attention at all. Why? Because we don't have a framework in our culture to discuss them, to bring them out and actually make sense of them. So I specialized in this for the last almost 2 decades now. And I've gathered up hundreds of cases. And so I put them in this book with the goal of, I want people to know that while death is difficult when it happens to our loved ones, there are amazing experiences that we can have as caregiver loved ones that can transform the way we look at death and transform the way we think or what we think is happening with our departed loved ones right now. And generally speaking, all the data points to a benevolent afterlife, a continuation of this person, of our beloveds, into another existence that is filled with joy and good experiences. So, and not, once again, I can't say that's the way it goes, through eternity, but I can tell you our data, which points to what happens right at the moment of death and soon thereafter, it is all positive. And more than that, it's sublime, it's divine, and the research is clear. So I'm an advocate for, let's really step more deeply into this experience of death and dying and see what's really happening. Hospice workers who are veterans know this. Most people who have these experiences feel reticent or even a bit anxious to share their experiences for fear of being told they're not grieving correctly, they're in denial, oh, they had a grief hallucination, all sorts of things. So it's really, this stuff is really buttoned up. And my hope is this book will open the door to get people talking about these experiences.
William, one of the things that we had talked about earlier before we started recording was I'm okay with death, right? And most people are when it's in order, right? We lose a grandparent. We know that people don't live forever. We lose even a parent as we get older. But when it's out of order and you lose a child or you lose someone that had a full life ahead of them, it's so much harder for us to wrap our minds around and move into that grief process, or even go through the grief process and not stay living there. I think I told you my mom lost my brother at 14, and she stayed in the grief process, in like the sorrow part of the grief process, for decades before she passed. And so how do people like wrap their heads around that?
Yes, this is the most difficult death that I'm aware of. And I, like I said, working with so many people in bereavement, when you lose a child or you lose any relative, even if it's a grandson, granddaughter, what have you, it is so, as you say, out of order. It's just not the way we think that life should unfold. So we have a number of those stories in our research, and I brought a few into this book. I'm going to share one in particular that I think will be, I should say, heartening to people in a certain way. So this is Amelia. She had her son, Tom. Tom was diagnosed with terminal cancer at 10 years old. And he died 3 years later. When he died, Amelia and Amelia's sister, this would be Tom's aunt, they were very close, all of them were close, report this: at the moment of death, a beautiful woman, that's what Amelia describes this, a beautiful woman appeared, and she was kind and compassionate and wise. And she drew Tom out of his body and essentially embraced him and gave Amelia this sense that quite clearly, she looked at Amelia and communicated, I've got your child. Thank you for being his mother. I'll take him from here. And for Amelia to receive that message, it changed everything for her. Like, first of all, she could never think that this would be possible. This is not in our culture, in our modern culture. We don't talk about these experiences. And if we do, they're considered weird or crazy or made up. But the fact of the matter is, there is lots of literature about this. I am the latest edition of that literature. But there's some from Great Britain in the 1800s and also the early 1900s, also from the UK. Point being is, yes, these experiences do happen. And in this case, fortunately for Amelia, her sister was also there to give witness to a portion of this experience that would affirm that, oh my gosh, I did have this. So I think a lot of people might have something like this, but it just gets dismissed almost automatically in our cognitive processing. In other words, since we don't know this is possible, our mind will kind of receive it initially and then push it off to the side. And so we never really come back to it. I want to share two other experiences too, now that I'm on this, because this is so important. I start the book out with this. Two women, mothers, one in Australia, in Sydney, the other in West Virginia. They both lose their children at birth. In both cases, a family member comes to meet them. In Michelle's from Sydney, her father shows up. And even though Michelle's son was on life support for almost 3 weeks, the father is there most of the time. Michelle isn't happy he's there because Michelle knows what he's there for. Michelle knows, and she's going to go away, Dad. I want to keep my son. But the father knows. Eventually, Michelle realizes that her son, Ben, is going to die. But her father is there to take him and tell her the same message. I've got your child. Thank you. I'll do the best I can. And likewise with Elizabeth in West Virginia, she loses Nicholas at the time of birth, and all four of her grandparents who are deceased show up, and her paternal grandmother comes forward and says, we've got Nicholas. He's going to be fine. These are spectacular cases. And what's amazing is you can't make this up. I mean, there is no paradigm that explains this. This isn't like an experience that's well known enough where you could be trying to fit into some sort of wishful thinking. These people come to us, they find us, and they're sharing their story often for one of the first times in their life. And they're a bit trepidatious about doing it for fear that they're going to be told, well, this isn't real. And yet it's the most profound spiritual experience for many of these women who have lost their children.
I can tell you that when I lost my brother at 14, there was a moment he was killed in a car accident. We were all there in a separate car, like we were the first ones on the scene. 4 other boys were injured, and my brother was the only one that passed. And at the scene, of course, my mom was hysterical, right? We're on a mountain road. And I remember feeling this peacefulness and looking up the road, and she was sitting next to my brother's body, and he had his arms wrapped around her, and she was all of a sudden peaceful. And my grandfather, who passed suddenly 6 months prior, had his arm. Now, I didn't hear any verbal saying, I've got him, but he had his arm on my brother's shoulder, and he had was comforting my mom, and she was peaceful from going hysterical to just sitting there in peace. And when I asked her later, why were you so peaceful? She says, I don't know, this sense of peace just came over me during this whole thing. Of course, when that sense of peace left her, she went back to hysteria, but I could see them next to her. And I, of course, knew what was happening. I was only 16 at the time, but I understood what was going on. So I thought that it was amazing, but I never talked about it, because if I said that, first, my mom did not want to be reminded of the deaths. We just did not talk about it. But if I said that to someone, they would have thought I was insane. Yeah, I saw Pop came with him, and he had his arm on him, and Mom calmed when he was wrapped his arms around her, and she felt that energy from him, but they would have thought I was insane.
Wow, Jana, thank you for sharing that, because you're giving voice to what I've heard hundreds of times. And this is why I wrote the book. These stories need to be out. The research needs to be known so that people like you and your mother and your family can know that, yes, it's horrible that you lost your brother at 14 and your mother lost, her son. And yet, if we can leaven that, contextualize that loss with, and it seems like your deceased loved ones, your Pop was there to comfort your mother and to take your brother to greet him. We call that the welcoming party because we see it all the time. And so, yes, the loss is hard, but there's much more going on in these death experiences, particularly the tragic ones, than our culture is letting in. And I know for those that I work with in grief and bereavement, when they can begin to lean into these experiences, to allow them to be real, to allow them to teach them, what does this mean for you? that Pop came to get, your brother? And for your mother, what would it mean if she can lean in there? I can tell you, because I do this work in my consultation room, is that it begins a whole nother process of like, wow, he was there. Pop was there. He did take him. He did greet him. Now we walk down a whole nother path. Like, what does that mean? That means that Pop's alive. That also means that my brother's alive. And it all felt really good. There was peace there. He was trying to bring peace, because that's the message that we get in these experiences. What does it mean to you? The after effects are this: I know my deceased loved one is alive and well in a benevolent afterlife. I know that I'll see him or her again. I'm no longer afraid of death or dying. I now see my life in a different context, because that experience allows me to see that this life is temporal. It has a purpose. It's important, but there's more. And so there's other impacts as well, but after effects, but those are the main ones. So yes, and I just thank you so much for sharing that, because when you say you never shared it, wow, what would it be like for your family, for you to gather and say, what did we all experience? How do we honor this too?
So I have shared it since then. I just didn't share it as a 16-year-old. But now that I understand death, and I understood that we were all together again, right? We all get brought back together. So there's just this temporary separation. And that gave me hope that I would see all of them again. So as life went on, that was over 40 years ago. As life went on for me, I've lost other people, and I've always been comforted by the fact that we'll be together again, right? I know that we have more to do, like we're going to be together again. So that made me feel really good that I know that. Here's the thing though, why aren't we having these conversations with children as they're growing up, so that their understanding of the death process isn't horrific? I tell this to my grandkids all the time. I have 7 grandkids. And when they say, you're never going to die and leave me, I'm like, oh yes, I will. I will never leave you. I will always be here. I live in your memories, your heart. But I will. That is what everyone does. And I'm not afraid of it. And I know that we will be together again. So you have that, always. But I tell them flat out, yes, I'm okay with that. You should be too. You can be sad for a little while, but then be joyful because of all the joy we shared. So I think we should be having these conversations with our younger generation growing up, so that their understanding of what happens during death and how that works. And maybe we can change that generation, which changes the next generation, which changes the next generation, right?
I couldn't agree more. And that's one of the missions of the Shared Crossing Project is, we study these experiences, we educate people about them, but we also have a second very important piece is we encourage dialogue. Pre-COVID, we'd bring people together, here in Santa Barbara, but also I would travel around and bring communities together to have these conversations. And they're almost like testimonials. People will, get in a group of 50 to 100 and share their story, just the way you shared your story with the death of your brother. And people listen and say things like, that's Jana. I mean, I see her all the time and she had this experience. Jana's normal and she's cool and she's thoughtful and, and so that begins, or that continues the transformation. And I don't want to miss this. I would conjecture actually that your comfortability with death may have been delivered in that shared death experience you had at the time of your brother's death. I can't say that for sure. Haven't had a deeper conversation, but it's very unique, your level of comfort. And I'm that way too. And those of us who have these experiences, we tend to be more at peace about death and dying, seeing it as a natural process in life.
100%. And I don't think there's anyone on the planet who gets a terminal, like I had a terminal diagnosis at one point in my life. And was I ready to go? No, I felt like there was so much more. Apparently there was, because it's been a decade and I'm still here. So I definitely understand the fear of dying, like not being complete here. What's the unknown there? It's kind of like that feeling you get when you get on a roller coaster, right? And you're getting strapped in, you feel your heart rate going up and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't want this. but when you're done with it, right, you're like, wow, I'm ready to do it again. So it definitely, I understand all those feelings, but it did change my perspective on death. It opened up the door of what was reality, you know, of the unknown. And then you start believing all those things, that yes, we are together again. And yes, you know, it is a good place where I'm not worried about my brother being in pain. I'm not worried about him being scared or alone because they're so young. I mean, someone loses an infant. What are they afraid of? It's my job to nurture you, to be there for you, to hold you when you're scared. And now they're out into the unknown. Who's doing that? Yet their family members are showing you who's doing that.
Yeah, beautiful. I couldn't agree more.
I love it. So let's talk a little bit more about, by the way, for those of you who are watching, this is the book. I got it in hard copy and soft copy because it's so awesome. But you guys can start getting that. When this goes live, it'll already be out. And I think reading about it can start changing your heart of how, well, you put it very well in your intro about teaching about dying well, right? You can die well and living better because of that knowledge of what the gift is we have here on this earth, and preparing those around us for when that time happens, like me preparing my grandkids. I know that my husband and I, hopefully if everything works the way stays in order, we will not outlive them, but I want them to be ready for that. So I think it's beautiful that you do that. And tell us a little bit more about some of the stories in your book.
Well, there's 28 stories. There's stories with, I've already shared the stories that, like I said, these are the ones that really pull on most of our heartstrings when parents lose children. There's also spectacular cases. For example, there's Mark, and Mark, here's a very interesting one. What we found is that about 2/3 of these shared death experiences can happen remotely, so that you don't have to be at bedside to have them, which, in the case, the 3 that I've already shared with you, those are all what we call bedside. Well, here's an interesting one. Mark is just finishing up a weekend of work, and he's driving back with a friend. He's in the passenger seat and he's reclining, resting. All of a sudden, he feels like something's going on with his father. Just feels it intuitively. Next thing you know, he's with his father in another dimension. Call it the afterlife for whatever, just loosely term. And he's there with his father. He notices his father is confused. He says to his father, he goes, "You've died." Now, Mark knew that his father was in a hospital in Canada, but he didn't know that he was dying that night at all. And Mark had been working the last week, so he had no idea. So he's there with his father, and somehow Mark, it arises within him the knowledge about how to help his father. And so he basically says to his father, essentially, turn this way, go to the light. There's the light, go to the light. He turns his father. The next thing he knows, he's accompanying his father and guiding him. And he says his father is very, very light and wispy, and he's kind of carrying him in a certain way, whatever that looks like in that realm of not having a physical body. And all of a sudden, Mark's grandmother, his father's mother, appears. And she's young and she's vibrant, and they were very close, all of them. And his father just embraces his mother, and it's just so much emotion and love. And then Mark's uncle appears. This is obviously Mark's father's brother, and they all embrace. And Mark says the light around them, they come out of the light, and the light behind them is just brilliant and affirming and loving. It's the most amazing experience, Mark has had in terms of feelings and emotions. And then Mark gets this sense, I can go no farther. Mark realizes, oh, this is it for me. And there's kind of a quick goodbye, but a good goodbye, I should say. It happened very quickly, but he realizes that's it. His father is in the embrace and care of his deceased loved ones, and Mark is back in his body and that car. And a few hours later, he gets a call from his brother. And when he sees the number on his cell phone, he picks up, he says, "I know, Dad died." And so That's just one of these experiences. We have so many features. I think I should say, like, what are the main features briefly? The main features are that you see that you're the departed. You see the dying in their transition. That's the dominant motif we see in all shared death experiences. It's a journey. You see them go from this human life into the afterlife. And so most of the time you see the dying. About 16% of the time, you'll see an elevated non-human entity that's good, that's either an angel or a guide or some sort of loving force. Sometimes they're described as beings of light. And then you also see, in about 13% of our cases, deceased relatives. So these are other predeceased, friends, family that are helping with the journey. And we have other features that are spectacular, like the light is another great. People always talk about there's something about the light, and so this is it. I mean, this sense of accompanying or being with or sensing, all this deep energetic, there's an energetic aliveness, and there's also these just, people say ineffable all the time. I don't have the words to describe what I felt there, but it was so joyous, and I kind of understood everything. They talk about this knowledge of any question they had about life and meaning was all somehow available to them and affirming. So when they come back to this life, they get enough of that. They don't bring all of that knowledge back there, but they bring enough of it back to reorient their life in a way that's more in line with their deepest values.
So, William, why do you think that this transitional experience doesn't happen for everyone? It's like a very small group of people, it seems to happen. Although I believe it happens for more people and they're like me and they just don't mention it. And so I think that if we had that comfortable space to talk about things like this, you would find that, like, I didn't know other people experienced what I did. I just didn't know that. So I think you would see it happens more, but it doesn't happen for everyone. And why do you think that? Like, all moms who lose their children don't have this experience to help them through it. So why do you think that is, that it doesn't happen for everyone?
Well, it's a mystery.
Yeah.
I mean, I would be far beyond my breadth of knowledge and research to assert even why this happens. I do know this from the research, and that is that people that are more receptive, open to death and dying, as well as those who have maybe, how do I say this, address their unfinished business with people. In other words, they are emotionally, psychologically, spiritually ready for the death of a loved one to take place. They're more receptive. I also believe that those who know about these experiences, know about the possibility when they're dying, I have a hypothesis that they can initiate this. And I have done groups, we call it a pathway group, where I train people everything I think that can contribute to the enabling of a shared death experience. And while our research is anecdotal because it requires people dying to collect it, about 25% of the people that I've worked with will have between 25% and I say even up to as much as 50%. I mean, I don't have I have to give a wide berth. I don't want to be held to this, but I can say at least a quarter of the people I've worked with will have a shared death experience when they're around a loved one, if they've done these protocols with them. But what's also inspiring is that if they don't have a shared death experience, they'll have some other type of what we call shared crossing, which is some sort of communication across the veil with either a deceased loved one, or after death, the deceased will come back to them and give them a type of what we call post-death communication, or a post-death vision or post-death visitation. All of these communications will let the surviving loved one know that the departed is alive and well. And so whether you have the shared death experience at the time of death or some of these other experiences, they all deliver the same affirming message that our loved ones after this human life are in a good space and they're well, and that we'll see them again.
That is the perfect place to end this because we've already done our 30 minutes and I'm so excited that we did. And this was a beautiful place to end this. So if you guys haven't already, go get the At Heaven's Door. Oh my gosh, I got confused with Mark's book for a second. At Heaven's Door. And it is amazing. Read those little stories in there, those little beautiful nuggets, and maybe find some hope for your situation or what you might be going through. So thank you so much, William, for being here. Where can people find you?
Sharedcrossing.com that's the organization that I started and still direct. And I would say one more thing to your viewers, and that is that we have a Shared Crossing story library. If you go to our website, Story Library, and you'll see videos of people sharing their story. They're snippets. They're not at all as deep as the written stories that I've done in the book, but you'll get an idea for these experiences, and perhaps more importantly, who they are as people. You'll realize, this is the feedback we get, they're so ordinary. These people are so normal. They're like you and me. And in fact, Amelia is there right now, and she'll be on this. So Amelia, who I talked about today, she lost Tom. She's there too. So you can see Amelia. Yeah, so that's it. And then, we're on all the usual channels and stuff for social media. So we are very much about dialogue and communication about these experiences.
Thank you, William. You guys go get the book. It's amazing and inspiring. So learn to inspire yourself about death, right? We don't have to go rushing to it, but at least we can start preparing our loved ones, understanding what happens after death. And I love that you're looking at the science side of it as well, because again, it's so hard for anyone to believe what they can't see, can't touch, yet we stick to the planet when we should be floating around, right? There's so many crazy things that happen. An apple falls out of a tree instead of floating. Like, there's so many amazing things that happen that we don't know how it happens, but we believe that it does. So thank you so much for being with us today, William.
Thank you, Jana.
Thanks for listening to the Oh My Health, There Is Hope podcast. Make sure to visit Jana's website, bestholisticlife.com, where you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Google Play, or listen there, so you'll never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you simply tell a friend about the show, that'll help too. Let's change the world together, one health expert at a time. Looking forward to seeing you next time.